I was actually abseiling off the side of it, so this is actually weirdly a far more comfortable position for me to be in today. But yeah, I'm going to get a little bit more specific in terms of security today and talk about application security. And over across the next 25 minutes or so, we're going to take a look at a number of different statistics from an earlier piece of research that we did, I think in May time. So if I can get my slides to switch. I've been hacked already. There we go. So, yeah, a little bit about myself as well. I was one of the authors who created this cloud-native application security survey. My background is very much in the engineering side, so I came through about 20 years or so of professional development, joining Sneak and more on the security side. So I'm very, very passionate about developers owning security, developers performing secure development as part of their job. And the cloud-native application security really took a look at some of the different pain points, the different processes that are happening day to day in many different organizations. We asked about 30 questions or so. As I mentioned, we launched it earlier this year and shared it across many social networks. We analyzed the data, and today I'm going to show you the general data as well as where financial services is either maybe sometimes a little bit better, sometimes a little bit worse, sometimes a little bit behind or ahead in various questions. So let's jump straight in, and we're going to talk about cloud-native adoption first. So this survey was really about when we think about how that transition that transformation occurs from more of the pre-cloud era into using clouds and containers and serverless functions and things like that, and how our posture changes and how we need to adapt. We wanted to first of all understand how much companies are investing in cloud and container technologies. So we asked a few questions. First of all, what percentage of your production environments are using these kind of technologies? And it actually quite surprised us how far adopted different production environments are. You can see here containers, almost 60% of production environments here using containers. Almost 80% are either using containers or serverless or a combination thereof. And half of production environments being deployed, being configured using IAC technology. So there is a real maturity already around the adoption of these cloud-native technologies. I looked at the financial services cut of the data, and approximately 10% of our respondents were from the financial services industry. And when we looked at that, surprisingly, this was actually very, very similar to the footprint of how financial services production environments look. One of the interesting things is around 10% in terms of where these are deployed. There was a 10% increase in on-prem, as you might expect, but everything else was largely quite similar. The next question we kind of asked was, well, why are people doing these transformations and moving into these more cloud-native environments? And we didn't expect necessarily security to be, up there as the leading reason why people would move across into a different architecture, but it was still there at a third, which is pretty significant. Some of the main reasons, and in fact, from the financial services point of view, the deployment velocity was about 12% higher than this figure, the more general figure. So people want to go there because it's faster, because it's easier to manage and easier to make your redeployments. That doesn't necessarily mean people don't care about security when they're moving across to cloud-native environments. So we can see here that 99% of companies recognized security still, obviously, as a key important piece to their posture. So let's now jump across to the incidents and concerns. So what are people actually experiencing, and where are they most concerned in terms of their new cloud-native deployments? First of all, the question we asked were, since moving across to a cloud-native environment, are you more concerned about your security posture, or are you less concerned? Do you not know, or has it not changed? And interestingly, around 4 times as many respondents said that they were increased concern. They had increased concern over their deployments than decreased. And in fact, that actually jumped up to 6 times when we just look at those from the FinServ aspect. So everyone had increased concerns, or largely increased concerns. When we think about what areas those increased concerns are, you can see that people really cared very much about things like misconfigurations, insecure APIs, known unpatched vulnerabilities as well. And I think as we go forward and as our industry changes and developers do more and more, outside of what I was doing 20 years ago, writing some code and pulling in some third-party libraries, developers are now involved more in the container construction, more in infrastructure as code, creating Kubernetes configs, doing Terraform scripting. There are many, many more places in which developers can affect the security posture of our deployed applications, and as a result, it's harder to control. So there's a couple of things here, and this is where I'm kind of passionate about security being involved in developers from the start, because as developers are making changes to Terraform scripts or Docker containers, how are those changes being checked? And with the DevOps way of working, where we're pushing to production regularly, this isn't something we can do periodically. This is something that we need to infuse in that development process. Something that's easy to say, a lot harder to do, but these results as well, you can see we've split into high adopters and low adopters of cloud native environments. And you can see, interestingly, high adopters and low adopters sometimes have different levels of concerns about different areas, including data leaks by insiders and malware as the two big ones there. Okay, so let's now switch across to where people are having incidents and whether that is actually similar to the concerns that people are having. Again, we can see that misconfigurations and known unpatched vulnerabilities are the two leading incidents that people had. And in fact, over half of respondents had either one of those two, or potentially both. And this is a really interesting piece because it's extremely important to actually make sure that where we're having our incidents is also where we're actually having our concern as well, and making sure that those are the areas that we're addressing. So with misconfiguration and known unpatched vulnerabilities being one of the big areas of headline makers where we're seeing people, breaches in third-party libraries or S3 buckets being just laying around publicly available. These are the kind of things where a one-line piece of configuration, which very often is omitted by development teams or security teams, it's those tests and those checks that very often help us with these concerns. So when we look at FinTech and financial services as well, we can see increased number of incidents across misconfigurations as well. And interestingly, one of the other questions that we asked about was around the tooling that people were using. And interestingly, IAC, infrastructure as code testing, which is very much where misconfigurations can arise from, that was an area that the financial services teams and groups seem to be investing a little bit less in, interestingly. So it's interesting that we see misconfigurations being a little bit higher on incidents there as well. So let's take a step back now and think about how, when these digital transformations occur, our problem set changes. Now, if we look on the left-hand side, we have a pre-cloud deployment where I, as a developer, I would write some code in my IDE of choice. I would type away, import some third-party libraries. But then when I go to deploy that, I would typically pass it over to an operations team or a platform team. And they would create the stack underneath that application, which would support the application and allow it to run. If I wanted to open another port, or if I wanted to change the database schema slightly, I would be putting tickets in and getting different teams to do that on my behalf. On the right-hand side here, we can see what happens in the current cloud environment, whereby what the developer can touch, what the developer can configure is greatly increased. If a developer wants to open a port or do something with their Docker container, they can just make a change and check their Docker container file back in. If a developer wants to make a change to a configuration file, Kubernetes config, Terraform script, CloudFormation, they make the changes and they check that in. So much more of that is now in Git repositories. It is part of the development workflow, and it's part of the AppSec issue. On the left-hand side, what we really needed was IT security solutions, where on the right-hand side, because we're going through developer flows, we need an AppSec solution to handle those cases. And when we look at incidents and when we look at threats in both of these, the threats are actually quite similar. If there's a port open on the left-hand side, it doesn't matter how it got opened, or if there's a port open on the right-hand side, it doesn't matter how it got opened, the attacker doesn't care. They care that the port is open, that they have access to a certain file system or whatever it is. The way we need to think about changing this is how we defend this and how we implement in our own processes the way in which the security testing, the security execution here is done. And what turns into the dev-owned scope versus other teams, you can see on the left-hand side, the dev tended just to be more caring about their own first-party code and third-party libraries, where on the right-hand side now, because of the additional scope that they have to work with to develop, that scope increases much, much more. Okay, so let's now talk about automation, which is a key piece of DevOps in general, which we need to include security in to help us build securely. So the first question we asked is, are you automated or are you manual in terms of your deployment flows? And the vast majority of people were automated to some degree, and around a third of people were entirely automated. And this is security testing as well as actually pushing applications to production. So what we did then was say, okay, for those of you who are entirely automated versus not at all, what are the benefits that you see from that? So we asked when people do their security testing. And it's quite significant here how you can see that anything pre-production or pre-deployment here has a significant increase in terms of the amount of security testing you do. And in fact, one of the areas that the financial services we noticed was reduced slightly in is source code repositories. So being able to test, connecting security tooling into your source code repositories and testing on pull request changes and testing as the team push code into those repositories. An interesting thing here on the left-hand side is the local development. And local development testing in your IDE of choice, where development teams would write code or a command line interface at a terminal, those are areas that are very, very hard to automate, and I would say almost impossible to get a developer to actually do that. However, when we see people who are entirely automated throughout the rest of the pipeline, we see almost developers doubling the chances of them actually using security testing in their development environments. So, a lot of what this is being able to push security into the mindsets of development teams, making it a part of their workflow through to production. The more you introduce security testing throughout that pipeline, the more likely a developer is to test something before they actually enter it into that pipeline. I remember when I started at IBM as a developer many years ago, and it was just at the time where unit tests were becoming cool and funky, and the idea of writing a unit test that you then pushed into a process and it broke later on, and you didn't want to be the person who broke that build. So as you add testing throughout the environment, you as a developer want to make sure that what you're doing early, where it's cheapest to fix, will actually pass through that. So security testing is no different. So when we think about how often people do security testing, automation, I think this one's a fairly obvious one, but it's great to see the numbers here supporting that. Automation is key in terms of if we want to add security testing into our DevOps pipelines, we need to make sure that security testing is automated throughout that workflow. And this is, of course, in anything from kicking off API testing or perhaps introducing testing into our Git repositories, into our CI environments, and so forth. On the converse side, monthly or less frequently in terms of our security testing. If you're not automated, it's likely going to take that long, and that just plain doesn't fit into a DevOps workflow. So shift left is not enough. What do we mean by this? Shift left is not enough. We talk about shift left in terms of doing things earlier and security testing, pulling that earlier into the developer workflows. One of the core areas of shift left is really thinking about it from a timing point of view. When we do security testing, because if we do it earlier, it's cheaper for us. It's easier for the development teams to do that earlier. But it's not enough, because what we need to do, shift left doesn't empower. Shift left is just a timing thing. What we need to do is empower developers to not just take responsibility for running the tests, but give them the information they need and that responsibility, that authorization, that authority to actually make changes and go ahead and fix. So we care about like almost shifting down, giving the development teams the tooling, the culture information, the how they work with security teams to be able to make the right choices. And security teams enable developers to, through that workflow, to be able to develop securely. So this takes us to this next piece, which is who is responsible for security for your cloud native applications. And this was an interesting one because there's obviously going to be a shared responsibility here for security across different teams, but it's interesting to see who thinks they are the responsible for it. And you can see on the left-hand side here of these graphs, the purple bubbles, these are the responses from the development organization, the people who state to themselves as developers or in that organization. On the right-hand side, these are responses from security. So you can see here that developers thinks that whether it's DevOps or DevSecOps or development teams, a very, very large group there, developers 37%. So developers are saying, 37% of them are saying that they own the security of their cloud native applications, which is a great sign. If you look from the security responses, that drops down to 10%. Okay, so it's a very, very interesting way of actually seeing developers who are kind of comfortable saying, look, what I code, I need to make sure I'm comfortable with. Not all developers will say that, and not all developers want to get too deep into security. Many, many developers just want to know enough of how can I securely code this application. From the security side, we see the IT security teams here, again, very, very much greater on the security responses for ownership versus the IT security team. In FinServe, in financial services, we see that exacerbated even more. So we say typically around 10% increase in numbers for the IT security teams and the application security teams, and the development teams actually reduces by around 10% or so. So it seems like in financial services, there is still more of a push of responsibility to the security teams, and that developer-first motion isn't necessarily getting as much traction in other markets. So in the previous session, there was a little bit of discussion about that kind of like the culture and a bit more about that collaboration. And this is another thing which I really care about a lot, particularly as a developer background. I care about when I want to talk to when I want to collaborate with another team, a security team, how can I best do that? Do I know the channels to do that? Do I know the right way that they can reach out to me? And one of the ways which we've seen work extremely well to bridge this gap and increase this collaboration is with security champions programs. And when we see development teams and security teams talk to each other, we very much see sometimes a kind of like them and us style, where when security team are talking to the development team, it's almost very much, how are you doing this? Why are you not doing this? Here's a problem. And it's never necessarily a great dynamic. Development teams can get very defensive and it sometimes can't work very well. But when we have security champions programs, a security champion is an individual in the development team. They're an engineer, but part of their job, 10, sometimes 20% of their job, is to enrich the development organization with different security processes and own those processes. And what we then see is very much a developer-to-developer discussion, where it's a developer trying to own and push process change and do different plans. So security champions is a really, for me, interesting way which can kind of bridge the gap between security teams and developer teams. And in terms of the caring, if we jump back to a previous question in terms of where are your concerns, interestingly, developers have just as much concern about security and about the changing security of their applications as the security teams themselves. So this isn't something which, when we think about care, this isn't something developers don't want to necessarily do, but developers have huge amounts of different areas of work. And if the fastest way, the route of least resistance, if that isn't necessarily the best path, the right way of doing things, sometimes workarounds and, developers will circumvent the right process. It's not something we can necessarily change, but we want to make security much more the right thing to do, the easy thing to do as well. So how does all of this actually help us at the end of the day? Now, when we look at the time to fix critical issues, we looked at this from an automation point of view. And we said, okay, for those people who are entirely automated, how fast can they actually make an effect? And when we think about measuring security and measuring our effectiveness, this is a great way of being able to measure that. When a security issue comes in, how fast can you resolve that? How fast can you actually eliminate that? And we see that people who have entirely automated pipelines are very, very fast. I think it's around 72% or a little bit higher in 1 day or less or a week. Okay, people who are not automated at all, you can see the numbers go far, far further to the right. In fact, don't know, even almost a third of people don't know how long it takes them to fix security issues. So automation at its core really enables us to not just identify where issues are, but allow us to react much, much quicker and make change much, much quicker. Also, one other thing about being entirely automated here is being able to identify issues. So being able to fix issues is great when you know an issue exists, but how long will these kind of vulnerabilities exist before we can even identify they're there? From the financial services point of view, it's actually quite a lot better in terms of the swing. 1 day or less actually increased by 5%, and the longer than a month decreased by 8%. So in terms of being able to react to critical security issues, we found financial services actually better positioned to do those kind of things. And that's everything I have. So thank you very, very much for listening. I'm also going to be on the panel straight after this, after the break. If you're interested in learning more about developer security and developer security platforms around AppSec, we have a booth just outside on the left-hand side. There's a whole ton of great folks who can work with you to see how Sneak can help you with that application security platform. Okay, thank you very much.